Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Happy to be joined again today by Josh Blank, research director of the Texas Politics Project. Josh, been a little under the weather lately. You okay?
I'm 90%.
I'm having different people ask. I've had a couple people ask me if you were okay, sort of.
Well, 90% plus or minus 2.3%.
Okay. Well, I ran into one of your neighbors, and he was commenting on your recent being a little under the weather.
Perfect. I hope he's a
listener. That was
listener.
less a concern with your health, maybe, but
I'd like to know. I wish he was a listener. I'm going to find out.
Well,
I'll let him know there's a reference to him on the podcast.
You need to let him know.
Okay.
So this week, there's a lot going on. I mean, to go, off script somewhat. I mean, we're in the thick of the session. It's a funny time. I mean, today, what I want to talk about is Donald Trump coming back to Texas. He's going to be in Texas this weekend for a campaign rally in Waco.
The kickoff campaign rally.
Which is
I don't really understand that. But
me either. We'll put a pin in that for a second. It is, we'd be remiss to not notice, a lot going on in the session. After, again, things just keep ramping up, tons of committee hearings, and we've gone from, is there's something going on today to, that period where there's stuff going on in multiple committees. House Public Ed was in late last night hearing the bill on library materials, HB 900, I think. 809? I think 900. And so there's a lot going on. And I think when we get to the end, it's kind of in my head to connect these things. We'll see if that works.
It's that point where you start opening up multiple windows of multiple committees. And
there's just a lot. Yeah, I mean, there's just a ton going on, and if you're not really tracking it, I mean, the people that are much more attentively tracking it than say I am because they have clients that track.
Right.
Sometimes in some cases, multiple clients with multiple bills. You're using stuff to track right now, and even that's just like, oh God, where did this come from?
Fire hose.
So, that said, it's telling, I guess, that this is all going on, and yet Donald Trump is coming to Texas this week, and it's a big deal.
We can't really not talk about him,
right?
Because
and that's
that's kind of the point.
That's sort of his cultivated asset. He's going to have a campaign rally in Waco, and the Trump event comes at a time where the president's very much back in the news. I mean, and, in terms of deja vu, the platform's different, the mechanism's the same. He put up a social media post this past Saturday, last weekend, alerting his followers to the claim that he would be arrested this week. He said Tuesday, which is, we record this, was yesterday there was no arrest,
right? Which
was not all that surprising. But that he would be arrested as a result of charges looming in New York City related to the not newsy hush payment he made to porn star Stormy Daniels to keep her quiet about an affair they allegedly had in 2006. And we could have inserted allegedly and all of that, even though this all seems pretty well documented.
Right.
But that's for a jury to decide. And in that post, I think most tellingly, and this was where the newsiest part, he urged his followers to protest if he was arrested, to get ready to hit the streets, if you will. Whatever one thinks of this, and there are a lot of issues to parse we can come back to later, it really does illustrate just how central Trump can make himself so easily and just how powerful his gravity in the party is nationally. And so I thought we'd look at it today. It's a good time then to gather and review some of the pretty large volume of polling data that we have on Trump's standing with voters in Texas, and look a little at the local, state-level political context of his visit to Waco. Seems to make sense. All right, let's start with a look at the unsurprising. Trump's job approval in Texas during his presidency, pretty consistently strong. where it matters among Republicans.
Right. I mean, it's important to note here that, whatever one thinks of the former president, at no point during his presidency did Republicans turn on him in Texas.
Yeah.
Full stop. End of sentence. Right. His approval rating among Texas Republicans never dropped below 78%. And from June 2018 through the end of his presidency in October 2020 polling, it never dropped below 86%. And so, there's a couple different ways to look at this, and we can talk about, opinions on him post-presidency too.
Right.
But the reality here is that, there's just this idea that there's some faction of Republicans for whom Trump is not, a viable presidential candidate.
Right.
It's like, it's not visible in the data.
Never Trump is not a big grassroots movement in Texas.
No, I mean,
there are some elites, a few Twitter people, but even among elites, I mean, there are not very many. I mean, Karl Rove.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Never Trump or libertarians. Who is bigger?
Yeah, and well, yeah. I mean, I think at the elite level, there's probably at least a couple more never Trumpers at this point.
Well, exactly, right. Now, do you want to talk about independent voters here too?
Yeah,
or?
I think again, we're focused on. I mean, you and I were kind of going back and forth. We haven't really even talked about it, but I mean, on one hand, we're focused so much on Trump's position in the Republican universe and primary voters, but I think there is something to say about independents. I do want to, before we move on to independents, though, I do want to add something to the Republican numbers, and that is, we didn't go back as far as we could have and look at where Trump's numbers were in 2015 and early 2016.
Mm-hmm.
And it is an interesting story that when those primaries were more competitive, and there's nothing miraculous about this, but I think it is part of having a complete memory of this, is that Trump didn't get into the race and everybody went, oh, he's our guy.
Right.
I mean, he did well among Republicans, but he wasn't in like the 70s and 80s in the early trial ballots.
No.
And even in his earlier approval numbers, he wasn't that high. I mean, he sold it.
Yeah, no, I mean,
he met the market.
He met the market. I mean, the other piece of that too is that people like winners.
Yeah.
So ultimately, I think a lot of the negative attitudes towards Trump among Republicans heading into that 2016 race were related, of course, to the fact they thought he was going to lose. I mean, that's a whole, very well-documented section of history. The other thing, that you didn't mention in the lead-up, and I'm sure we're going to come back to here, that's also related to Trump this week is sort of the ongoing sparring between he and Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. And so that's also why I think, the other piece here that we want to look at is we want to look at, view among Republicans as, Trump kind of hurdles towards the Republican primary. But also, it's interesting to look at independents, for one, in a state like Texas, where there are no party primaries in terms of party registration, so anybody can vote in any primary.
Party registration, right.
But also, it's hard not to kind of just want to look around the corner past the primaries for a second.
Sure.
So what's the story of, for Trump among independents, right? Well, it's a far more mixed, right? We'd say, overall, he enjoyed net approval among independents in his first year presidency, which means more had an approving opinion of his job performance and a disapproving. This is something I think we generally expect. It's it's historically called a honeymoon period.
Right.
President comes in, they've won, they're given the benefit of the doubt. And so generally, presidents in the beginning of their terms have better job numbers than as they go along and make decisions, et cetera, right? So after that first year, though, there was a lot of oscillation during the second and third years, and then it settled on net disapproval. So more independents holding a negative view of Trump than a positive, or a negative view of his job performance and positive, starting in about October 2019, and then just continued to decline until the end of his presidency. And so and it really hasn't recovered since then.
Right.
Okay, so then...
Well, I mean, but then the other thing to add to that, I think, in terms of thinking about independence is that, talking about Trump is, it's the king of, but on the other hand, no matter what especially in terms of public opinion. So,
right.
I mean, the other thing to note about that, just to, is an asterisk, is that I think two things. One, and I think we did a podcast on this during the election season, independents, small group.
Yep.
Between 10 and 15% ballpark.
Right.
And cranky.
Cranky, yeah.
And cranky generally about politics, which is kind of why they're independent.
Yeah, they don't like
anybody. It's part of the
anybody.
explanation for them being independents. But particularly cranky in the last, tough few years,
Yeah. I mean, they don't like anybody very much.
Right. Yeah. And so as much as, Trump's numbers have flagged, Biden's numbers were never strong.
Right.
And are, even worse than Trump's by a few points, in the sense that his approval rating, I think, is 4 or 5 points below, or his favorability rating is 4 or 5 points below Trump. If you wanted to connect that to his job approval, kind of in the same ballpark. So,
it'll be interesting because I think, when Trump initially, I don't want to say burst onto the scene, I hate the way that sounds, but initially assumed the presidency. The other thing is, you could imagine for independents who are sort of turned off by both parties, the idea of the outsider mantle and all that stuff, does that really carry through when you're running for your second term again as someone who has been
your
president?
third campagin for your second term?
The whole outsider thing is getting a little tricky there, right?
Yeah, well, and I think, and I think, I don't know. If this is going to be about Trump, it's not too much of a digression. But what you define as an outsider,
right?
And what it was that Trump. Trump had not run for office before, but part of his virtue was that he was tapping into something that people did respond to, that outsider, insider.
Right.
That's going to be put to the test now in any number of ways, not only in terms of Trump. You mentioned DeSantis, some others. So, I think, the independent thing remains interesting. But, it's funny, we talk and talk and talk, or, we used to we dismissed independents. Now we talk and talk and talk about them. In Texas, they do behave in reasonably predictable ways when pushed in a very polarized atmosphere with fairly clear alternatives. That does, lead us to the phrase of, used in here awkwardly many times, the kind of conservative substrate of the state's political culture, right? At the end of the day, if you can be a grumpy as hell independent, if you're going to actually get up and go vote, the kind of weight leans towards a Republican candidate in Texas.
This is true. I think,
think about the O'Rourke.
It leads towards the known in a lot of ways, So we can come back to that. I want to come back to that discussion about the independents and sort of some other stuff at the end. But so then if we look past Trump's presidency, to sort of just favorability items, he's no longer in office. You can't approve of the job he's doing or disapprove, and just say whether people, have a positive or negative view of him. And this is, one of those things that at first we weren't necessarily looking to track, but as he, as the former president continued to insert himself or be inserted into sort of national news, it became kind of obvious that we needed to keep. Well,
I think thinking back, as soon as the January 6th riots happened and he had that central role in it, was kind of baked in. We were going to keep checking in on him.
Yeah, and see what happened. And the main thing to know is nothing happened. Just to make it real simple.
Yeah.
There's not really anything.
Maybe a little bit, but it's come back. Well, yeah. Anyway,
I don't. Sure. Not where. I don't say this. At no point during Trump's presidency or in the post-presidency period has anything happened that has significantly shifted the positive views of Republican voters in any notable way.
Right.
If we look at our February, let's see, I'm just trying to pick some data. It doesn't even really matter. Honestly, it doesn't matter because it's about the same. If we're looking at the end of his presidency where he's about 86% job approval, that's around where he is in terms of favorability ratings among Republicans. Yeah. And it's pretty high. That sounds pretty good. And again, classified documents, no impact, right? January 6th, no impact.
Yeah.
And so really, I think at this point, and this is something that we've talked about a bunch. There's not very much, it seems, that's going to happen that's going to change the ultimate sort of universe in terms of, what, again, Republican voters, Republican primary voters think about Donald Trump, at least right now.
And we're not just sort of saying, well, seems like the election, didn't change people's. You were talking to everybody loves a winner. That didn't really, by denying the fact that he was actually the loser.
Yeah, it's worked.
That helped him, and that stuck with people, right? In other words, most Republicans still, more than 2 years, after January 6th, and more than 2 years after the new president was inaugurated, most Republicans in Texas still see Biden's 2020 win as illegitimate.
Yeah, about 2/3 usually is basically, across multiple measures that we've asked, and this really has not shifted. It's not shifted among, Democratic views.
Who do view it as legitimate?
Who do view it as the majority of independents view the election as legitimate, but I would say a slight majority.
Close. So it's usually pretty close.
Like 54% or something in that range. But about 2/3 of Republicans say that the election was illegitimate. What's interesting, one sort of interesting kind of national polling caveat to put on this, just to make it clear, is that more recent polling has found that when you ask Republican voters whether or not there's evidence to support that contention, the share who say that they do not have evidence has gone up over time. So to some extent, I mean, this isn't happening in an entire vacuum, and there's not necessarily this. I mean, I don't know if this is. I think this is probably a good thing. There's not this entire alternative universe going on where there's this, evidence that has still not been presented in a court and adjudicated fairly that would make Donald Trump the president. No, I mean, there's a fair number of Republicans who are saying, look, we don't think there's evidence, but there's still something fishy here.
Yeah.
And ultimately, to your point, I think that's a really good point. Are you really a loser then?
Yeah.
Certainly debatable. Right?
Well, and that's been his, look, as wild as Donald Trump can be, he's got some message discipline in the key areas that pertain to his image and the fact that, he is not a loser and was not a loser in 2020. Yeah. And that it was stolen has been a pretty persistent line. I mean, I think there have been times and some of the lawyers around him have gotten him to tone that down a little bit, but it never sticks. I mean, it's one of the conversations going on right now about Trump and this whole idea that this time he's running a more disciplined campaign, less, fewer family members commanding the campaign, more campaign professionals. But the very fact of that post last weekend suggested that it's not completely taken.
Well, I mean, it's sort of like...
There's no campaign consultant in his right mind who's going to go, yeah, Mr. President, you got to go out there and say you're going to get
arrested.
You're going to get arrested and call people to hit the streets in your favor. I don't think...
Are you sure, though?
I'm not positive. I mean, what's it...
yeah, you don't need names.
Yeah, I'm thinking, what's it...
No, I know who you're thinking
Jason
of.
Miller.
Oh,
Jason Miller may be giving him that advice if he's,
I mean, you said message discipline, and I think the other thing I'd add to there is, he's incredibly strategic. And I mean, one of the things that's interesting, and I think, was one of the challenges of his last campaign was, and this is the challenge of a national campaign as opposed to a Republican primary, is, mobilizing your own grievances as the grievances of other people. And we've talked about this before and how, that can kind of be, I think, it's hard to show, that can be a bit of a challenge. But I think one thing that's kind of been clear from, watching this over time is that Trump is, probably at his strongest when he has a clear grievance and a clear enemy that he can mobilize his supporters around. Right. And when he's like, they're
after us.
They're after us. They're after me. And if they're after me, they're after you. Right. Oh, and it's a district attorney in New York.
Yeah.
A Democratic district attorney. Perfect.
Yes.
And that's the thing. I mean, much of you've been following this most of the week. A lot of the coverage has been about the reaction with, among Republicans to all of this. Right. And so there's a lot of the, hey, don't protest. We don't need our likely 2024 nominee creating another incidence of public violence during a routine court proceeding, right? But on the other hand, we should definitely drag those traitors and communists before Congress and have them testify about everything.
Right.
So, I mean, there's a way to play this that is, and in some ways what's really interesting, it's like, Trump is holding, he's holding a lot of these guys hostage. I mean, very clearly, because you can't say he's wrong, he shouldn't do this or whatever. And so ultimately what it does is it is bringing the party, and I'm going to say in this case, and this is where I think, the pig pie po thing is useful. Like there's a party in the electorate, the party in government, and the party in party organizations. Here he's bringing the elites, the party and government closer to him because they can't push.
Yes, it's kind of a bear hug.
It's a bear hug. You saying, okay, is it done?
Yeah. Well, and that is one of the things that people have been looking at is that I think it was Punch Bowl this morning. This is happening a lot more in the House than it is in the Senate. Yeah. Which is an interesting dynamic, in and of itself in the United States right now in terms of the differences between the two chambers. So I think that, as we look at this, maybe, what is it? Tells us a bunch of different things, but, let's do the DeSantis thing now. You brought that earlier. I think now is the time. So what does it mean in terms of what is this telling us about Trump's position in the political universe? So on one hand, as you raise, you've got national Republicans having to figure out what they're going to do about this and where they're going to come down on it and parse the response that enables them to not be weighed down by the actual thing at hand right here, which is nobody other than the creative way that DeSantis did this, I thought. Nobody wants to really come down and say, here's my position on the whole issue of hush money to the porn star he's said to have had an affair with. It's more, and it lends itself to focusing, as you said, on the agents of prosecution of Trump.
Right.
But there's also this whole other thing about the positioning for primary politics, which is clearly, it's impossible to not feel like that's driving at least part of Trump's behavior other than, simple survival and avoiding prosecution and all of this.
Yeah, but I think this, it's hard for me not to think it's doing a lot to drive a lot of these other elites' behavior. Right?
Yeah, no,
and you can see them, you can see the gnashing of teeth. And the consternation trying to, in some ways, if you're a, whatever, congressman from, pick a state, pick a random exurban district,
pick a random gerrymandered, written for Republican incumbent congressional district.
Yeah, but one that's, competitive enough, not terribly, right? And you're sitting here thinking to yourself, do I need to pick a candidate right now?
Right.
And in some ways, Trump's not asking, look, I was going to say Trump's not asking for that fealty right now, and then I have to kind of stop and say he would take it. And I think he kind of he is somewhat trying. And so, it's interesting as he forces people's hands, it does force someone like DeSantis now to say, okay, and the interesting thing about we're going to do DeSantis is the coverage of DeSantis has been, to my, this is my take of it, has been a lot of, DeSantis is running a presidential campaign without holding a press conference or saying he is, right? And what's been interesting is
ironically, who's put the most heat on DeSantis? Donald Trump.
Yeah, exactly. Donald Trump's been the first person to force him to kind of, come out and really, take that a little bit more head on. Right. And so, that's pretty interesting. Now, having said that, what's really interesting about DeSantis is how strong he is. Now, a lot of the very, very, very recent polling that comes out is saying, he's only at 26%. I'm just making, this is about what it is, but he's only at 26% in national polling and trial ballots. Well, two things. One, that's amazing. If you've been polling any sort of trial ballots for any period of time as a professional and especially as sort of a nonpartisan person, the fact that an out-of-state governor, first term or second term now, could, basically come out and
insert himself in that
and command a quarter of the electorate. Remember, delegate math is complicated when it comes to this kind of stuff.
Quarter of the primary electorate,
right? That's amazing. Our numbers in Texas show, Ron DeSantis is not at the level of Trump, but he's not far off. And we've talked about this in the recent poll. We're talking about favorability numbers for Trump.
Right.
DeSantis, trails Trump in favorability by about 5 or 10 points, but it's not because a bunch of other Republicans are saying, we don't like him.
Yeah.
It's because they don't know him as well. But we're talking about, again, governor of another state.
It's something like, 3/4 had an attitude about him. A little more than that. I think 22% was the people with no opinion.
Right. And I guess all I would just say is I'm gonna channel our colleague Darren Shaw here and say, there's no national primary.
Yeah.
So a national trial ballot that finds a quarter of, Republican voters in the country think that Ron DeSantis should be their next presidential candidate. It's easy to kind of dismiss that, but a presidential campaign is a long thing.
Right. And we've talked about Trump's strengths up to this point. The share of Republicans who said that Trump should run for office again in 2024 fell, probably close to within the margin of error for within the margin of error for Republicans only. Fell about 5 points from 61% in August of 22 to 56% in February of 23.
Right.
Right, the share who said, and that those people didn't move into the don't know, they moved into the he shouldn't run. Now, I think December through February was not very good for Trump.
Sure.
But not the first time we've said that.
Yeah, right.
And in fact, as you said, the very recent national polling has found him, as he's launched more of an offensive, and he's been more in the news and people are rushing to his defense, his numbers vis-a-vis DeSantis have gotten better.
But the question that I think that raises for me is that like a durable expression of preference, or is that just the oscillation of the news cycle, right? And I think there's a lot of reason to believe at this point that's a lot more about oscillation in the news cycle.
Right. I guess what and this is kind of where we sort of wind up, is that, it is the oscillation, but what do you. The mean point would still seem to really favor Trump at this point.
100%. Well, and let me go back to the same point.
Yeah.
Delegate math. The reality is that, if Trump can manage to win, let's say, 40% of the vote in most states in a field that let's say the field, and we should expect the field to expand and have, the rest of the vote fracture, which is, and listen, this is a situation in which, there's a good point. There's a good point in an analysis I read recently by Nate Cohn of the Times, and I'll give credit to that, which is to say, if you look at where he's sitting on average in those polls, the real question to my mind is like, what's his floor?
Yeah.
And the thing is that if you have a floor in the Republican primary of a third, you're going to be around for a while. If you have a floor in the Republican primary of 40%, you're probably going to win the nomination.
Yeah.
And he's above that pretty significantly. Now, again, it's very early, and I want to say, there's a difference between I don't have a ton of examples of former presidents running, again, for office, certainly not in the era of polling.
Yeah.
And so I'm thinking I'm thinking of some back in the early 20th century, right? And so, he certainly has a name ID advantage here that's going to be pretty hard to overcome for any other challenger. And Ron DeSantis is going to be the test of that. I think the thing that's interesting about Ron DeSantis is you have to admit he's a pretty adept politician to have done what he's done so far so quickly. Now, I see.
Well, I think that, look, you kind of can't argue his success. The guy just won his gubernatorial re-election campaign but he won by, 20 points against a Democrat and everybody was tired of, as I heard somebody characterize it recently. I can't remember who it was, but who said it?
The Democrat. Okay.
The Democrat was Chris, yeah. But I also think, look, there's a debate going on right now. Same debate happened with Trump to some degree, but it's really happening with DeSantis right now, which is, yes, this guy's been very successful.
Mm-hmm.
Has it been a relatively easy glide path? And is he now going to hit the test that, maybe, demonstrate the boundaries of his talents or, force him to grow and get better?
Yeah.
And look, historically, we've seen lots of successful candidates start off with a lot of, their initial success and their initial rise is heralded as proof of their political skill. Then they try to step up to a presidential campaign, and either they wash out,
right,
or they grow and they get better and they adapt and they go on to succeed. And, I think a lot of that winds up getting lost in our memory of people. There was a period where, Obama had to call everybody in his campaign and say, hey, this isn't working.
Right.
Right. And so you go, we need to figure this out. And a lot of successful presidents of, candidates and who won the presidency have been in that. So I get that.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think it's interesting that we are in one thing about DeSantis coming out early and succeeding earlier is that this is happening sooner.
Yeah, which
we're hitting a critical threat, and whether it's a critical threshold, but we're definitely hitting a moment. Yeah. And as we record this, DeSantis played another big piece.
Oh man!
Yesterday doing an interview with Piers Morgan. This whole Piers Morgan thing, I want to.
Yeah.
Why? How did? I thought we were done with Piers Morgan, but anyway, I guess he went overseas and
That's fine.
retooled in his homeland, but. In which DeSantis is very critical, is taking the path that he's clearly going to try to path. He did it in another shorter interview segment earlier this week where he says he plays the party line. Why isn't the New York DA solving urban crime, et cetera, et cetera? But then this kind of, I do think that we're even having to deal with this raises questions about the president's character, which, the New York Daily News, it gets into the internecine politics of the New York Daily News, played this on the front, which, the Murdoch people had to know was going to just kill Trump and all this kind of thing. But one of the interesting things I was thinking about that, and it does bring us back to Texas a little bit before we close, is that, part of DeSantis's argument, it's ironically, having just mentioned Obama,
I was thinking it.
Is that he's kind of like no drama DeSantis.
That's what I was thinking too.
I've done all this stuff and you haven't seen all this other bullshit happening.
Right.
Right. I'm just going there. I'm pushing forward. I'm fighting wokeism. I'm doing all the things you want me to do. And, no one's asking me about my relationships with porn stars because these aren't the things that are happening. And I'm not interested in social media. And I don't even know how to spell sanctimonious.
Ha ha ha.
Said the guy with an Ivy League degree. But
Yeah, but and the thing is here is that, like, I think that this, I was thinking the exact same thing, the no Trump Obama thing, right? But it's like this plays on an idea that the data does not support.
Right.
This is something that, again, I think among elite Republicans, there's this idea that, like, no, I mean, I think even a lot of elite Republicans might say, hey, look, I agreed with Trump on a lot of the policies, on a lot of the goals, what he was trying to accomplish in the Middle East, what he's trying to accomplish with respect to trade, with respect to, labor regulations, so on and so forth. I just didn't like the way he did it. I didn't like the way that it was so difficult to get these things accomplished because of all the extra stuff that came along with it.
Yeah.
And it made it so hard, right? And that's this very elite argument. And then we look, cool. But then we look at the voters and we can say, okay, overwhelmingly positive views. This idea that there's this, sect of Republicans sitting here, especially in Texas, who have these negative views towards Trump. It's almost nobody. When we look at, this question of, we asked a couple different times a couple times during the first impeachment trial, and then again after January 6th, whether Trump had ever done anything that would disqualify him from holding future office. Just,
We have to rerun that question.
Oh, we are. But and the answer was no. I mean, I think 89, probably close to 89%
and that's why I
of
think
Republicans.
We have to rerun it because I'm fairly confident we'll get the same.
No, we'll get the same. We'll get the same thing. Said no, and so, and I'll just one more example of this. I remember in that sort of middle of Trump's presidency, when there was a lot going on after Charleston, after a couple other. I think after the shithole countries comment, we basically ran a pretty extensive sort of Trump approval battery. How's he handling each of the fund? Relations with Congress, because there's a lot of problems going on in terms of even work with Republicans. And, across the board, most Republicans said it was fine.
Yeah.
And most of these were controversial areas, and it was sort of shocking because there had been so much in the news about how, this was early on where I think people were still coming to grips with sort of the different style and approach. And when we asked the public, and especially Republicans, hey, is this still good? Thumbs up, double thumbs up.
No, the public, I mean,
and so this whole, there's this desire for less drama and the policy goals. It's like, where are you seeing that?
Well, but I think that's what, that's what I was going to get at, though. What's interesting about that is that in the context of that public opinion thing, I mean, the play by DeSantis, whether it's successful or not, points to something interesting, and that is, DeSantis is currently the successful version of the Trump Republican Party, or the Trump stream of the Republican Party in power.
Yeah.
Which is different, right? Because the last time that got tested, it failed.
Right.
Right? Because Trump lost. It failed nationally.
Right.
And so you've got DeSantis now trying to run in this new ideologically driven, but programmatically kind of somewhere between fuzzy and different. It's not even programmatically. It's like, what are the ideological drivers of the Republican Party right now? And not to get too cosmic in this question we've touched on. How is the current Republican Party and its most prominent avatars defining conservatism? And DeSantis is making a play for that based on his management and what he's done in the state. And it's an interesting contrast with what we're seeing in Texas, and it really does remind me of two things. So one, as we said, I think last week, we don't have a Republican presidential candidate from Texas so far.
Right.
And, I'm still betting we don't.
I'm betting
at least not one that's competitive. Right?
Certainly not someone leaving a position of
that.
office. Yeah.
And then there's what we're seeing going on right now in the Texas Republican Party in the active legislating and policy part of the cycle, which is a real struggle over how a Trump-defined Republican Party governs.
Yeah.
Right? Because, you think about the various things we've been talking about when we've talked about the various things we saw in the polling, there is still this churn between traditional governance concerns and the need to speak more directly to a more mobilized faction of the Republican Party that is talking about a lot of the things that DeSantis is talking about: woke business, woke education,
gender modification,
the sense of where we are, in terms of various, what we used to call identity politics, how that affects governance and behavior, and trying to roll those back. And I think that the And so the Trump, it's a thing I've been kind of thinking about. I can't quite get my head around it completely, but it's an interesting undercurrent. And again, I think it is probably more right now an elite argument, or an elite conversation, but it is elites trying to figure out, I think most of whom are done with Trump, how they navigate this new environment. And I think that's why there's been so much attention to DeSantis from Republican elites, because maybe this is the way we don't poke the bear in the Trump electorate, given what we've seen, but we kind of stabilize the institutional governance part of this.
You know what I mean? Hearing you talk about this, you know what it's like to me? It's like I brought up the pig pie Poe thing again, and it's like, it's almost as if, the party, the Republican Party in government broadly, that party is in a lot of ways DeSantis's party right now. I mean, he's defining the terms. He's really, pushing the policy direction and kind of showing the way that, again, I think the way to approach a lot of these issues. And I mean, like watching Style and Substance and all that kind of stuff. I mean, there's an interesting line in that in the Piers Morgan interview where he basically said something to the effect of like, look, I'm just trying to I'm not going to pretend there are like multiple different realities. Like this is the reality and we're going to move from there. Right. And so I think he's showing a path forward, both politically and from a policy standpoint of but then the party in the electorate is Trump's.
Right.
And that's creating some tricky friction points.
Yeah. I mean, can you tap into this? It's what I think Ted Cruz has kind of given up on.
Yeah.
Right. In the sense is, I was tapping, I mean, there's this sentiment and set of attitudes, and sentiment, I think, is also kind of important. Predispositions, whatever you want to call it, in terms of attitudinally, but that's there that Trump, has had a, significant demonstration effect.
Yeah.
That, this is kind of what you need to tap into at the level of the mass base of the party to succeed. How can you do that and govern and manage the fact that it's Trump that activated all that, and Trump's not going away?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that, and we'll end this up. I mean, I'm thinking about this idea of, how do you meld sort of feeling as if you are under siege in America because of your views, but in a state like Texas where you've had all the levers of government and a conservative government for more than 2 decades,
it's
right?
It's the combination of the under siege,
mentality
meme, right? And the fact of institutional governance, right? And look, the answer in Texas at this moment, as I read the legislature, the powerful answer that's been promoted by the governor for a few years, for the length of his governorship, but is now in some ways being embraced by the legislature, though with some friction, is, well, what you do is you use those levers of power to implement these goals, no matter how much they're pressing the boundaries of previous political norms and even laws and constitutional guarantees. And, we've been kind of dancing around that, but that's kind of where I wanted to wind up today, I think, is that, we're looking at this big conversation, and that's, Trump makes things, there's so much fog of war anytime Trump is involved. And frankly, DeSantis has his own smoke machines, right? Fogging things up. But when you get to watch the legislative process at the state level, and you're watching it closely in action, and you're watching the same, it's not like this is devoid of conflicting personalities and agendas. Right. But right now is one of those moments. It's like, okay, we got the levers of power. It's a good gauge for like where the balance of power is. And that's why we're having trouble, I think, figuring out like what is actually going to get out of the legislative session and what's not, is because that question is so active, and those politics are so active right now. And they're active not just in the usual, people maneuvering to, see who's going to Zoom who, but there are big underlying, more tectonic things going on in the party that are being fought out before our very eyes. And I think with that, we'll probably return to some of those questions next week. Although who knows? We'll see what happens in Waco.
I was going to say Saturday it could be wild.
Yeah, it could be wild.
Could be wild, guys.
That's good. So with that, thanks Josh for being here. That was fun. Thanks to our excellent production team in the Dev Studio and the College of Liberal Arts at UT Austin. Data we talked about, as always, at texaspolitics.utexas.edu. And we'll have a blog post that corresponds to this, so that lays out a bunch of the data on Trump that should be out by the time this is out, I think. I think it's pretty close to ready. Go to our website at texaspolitics.utexas.edu, hit the blog section, go to the blog page, and it'll be prominently featured. So thank you for listening. Be well, and we'll be back soon with another Second Reading podcast. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.